بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين نبينا وقدوتنا محمد عليه أفضل الصلاة وأزكى التسليم اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا وزدنا علما يا رب العالمين. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. It's a pleasure to be here, mashallah. Great work that you're all doing, and a pleasure to know Brother Amir and everybody else who's part of this team. Malaysia is a wonderful place. I have big hopes for Malaysia, ummatically and otherwise. I think that it's really inspiring to be here and see some of the initiatives that are going on, and especially as we move into a more and more connected world digitally. It's important that dawah in the English language, all the places that it can reach, be coordinated and optimized for strategic benefits that benefit the Ummah. Right now we live at a very, very interesting time where American du'at can come here to Malaysia, to Indonesia, and we can try to set up organizations such as Ummatics, those that overlap with Pemkir and others. It's a very exciting time. There's a lot of work to do, and there's also a lot of good work being done. So I'm very grateful to be here to talk about a thinker who I'm close to personally. I was actually visiting Hallaq in New York last month, and we correspond pretty often. And he has this is my ijazah. I have ijazah from Hallaq. So you know that you can
believe, yeah.
You can engage in what I say as how Hallaq is trying to do. He has told me that and that I would not mention this except to establish trust, that he has told me personally that I am the person who most understands his works. And I have explained his works, 2 of them successively on YouTube, on the YouTube channel called Blogging Theology, run by Paul Williams. I've gone through The Impossible State, and we have gone through restating Orientalism, or at least most of it. And so I find Hallaq extremely important, his thought extremely important to the moment in which we live. And I also have a personal investment in his thought because it represents my own personal journey to Islam. I was someone who began as an international relations major in political science, also a little bit dabbling in political theory. I was fed a breakfast, lunch, and dinner every day, not yet of nasi lemak, laksa, mi goreng,
durian.
Like that. Durian, no. Of Foucault, of Spivak, of Chakrabarti, of these post-colonial thinkers, and also post-structuralist, Lyotard.
Yeah,
exactly. And if you're going to go through my path to Islam, you could draw a very straight line from Foucault to Talal Asad, and then eventually to Islam. And only later did I discover Hallaq after studying in Medina and coming back. So even though I have a personal investment in it and it speaks to me personally, I want to reiterate what was said in the intro. That doesn't mean that I'm emotionally attached in a way that you can't challenge. I want people to challenge Hallaq's thesis because, as we say in Arabic, iron sharpens iron. That we're here for ummatic work, and at the end of the day, we want the work to get done. So if I'm wrong and Hallaq's wrong, as long as someone's right, and we can do it, then let's do it. Right? Yeah. We're not ideologues or dogmatists. We're not more invested in being right than we are in achieving results. And so, even though I believe that Hallaq's work is, extremely essential to understand, and I see it as by and large true and accurate and descriptive and also provocative, I, like everybody else, stands in the possibility of being wrong. And so we welcome challenges or clarifications or extensions, applications, etc., the whole 9 yards. Understanding that trajectory coming from Foucault to Asad and then to Hallaq is important to get a background in what Hallaq's project is. So Foucault, as the most popular representative of the postmodern school of thought, gave us something that Alasdair MacIntyre calls genealogy as a methodology of inquiry. Alasdair MacIntyre being the Scottish philosopher who has some books such as A Short History of Ethics and also three modes or methods of moral inquiry. Right? That modernism or modernity being represented by particular methodologies and resulting in particular genres. And we'll talk about that because that's also the object of Hallaq's critique. And then postmodernism, which is a response to modernism, being largely about deconstruction. And deconstruction has a method to it, and the method is genealogy, trying to determine where ideas came from. Now, the difference between Foucault and an Essed or a Hallaq is that Foucault is probably what you would call a pure deconstructionist. He doesn't have any replacement in mind. He's just taking things apart, looking at them in new ways, showing you where they came from. And there's a decolonial aspect to Foucault as well, even though he dropped the ball and missed a lot of opportunities when it came to Algeria or Tunis or other places. But the idea, or at least the function of Foucault's methodology, was to turn a lens that had traditionally only pointed at the Orient and to turn it around and turn it back onto the West. So his analyses of the hospital and the school system and disciplinary power and governmentality, right? They're all using methods that were traditionally used by the Western anthropologists, the Orientalists against Eastern and Muslim peoples, in order to desacralize them, to make them seem mundane, and sacralize them, to make them unsacred. So, built upon Foucault's work, Talal al-Essed achieved a revolution in the field of anthropology, which was by doing something that very few people had done before, which was taking the method of genealogy and applying it to secularism and religion, but also secularism. So again, in the spirit of Foucault, turning some of the tools of the Western disciplines back in on itself, whereas anthropology had typically been used to look at religious subjects, Borneo, Papua New Guinea, people who believe in superstitions and taboos, right, with all of the colonial baggage that communicates, as well as creating a plausibility structure for violence against those people. Talal al-Essed brought it back again and focused the same tools not on the superstitions of the Orient, but on the superstition of the West, which is secularism. To make something that seems self-evident and imminent and intuitively true, to make it seem strange and particular, not universal. And I could confidently say that that was the intellectual intervention that led me to Islam. That at the point before I had read Essed, I was a leftist, I was an anarchist, I was a Marxist, etc. I did not believe really in much of anything, but I was very into post-colonial theory. When I started to understand the true nature of secularism, that was when I started peeling things back and becoming interested in one of the resultant projects of post-colonial thought and even post-modernist thought, which Foucault unfortunately did not undergo, which is that of recovery. That some post-colonial thought concerned itself, especially subaltern studies, the subfield of subaltern studies, concerned itself with this idea of recovery. And you could say that there is a schism within post-colonial theory and those circles as to what's the next move? What do you do with all of this deconstruction and this looking at Orientalism and all of the tools of the Orientalists? One school is that, well, it's all too far gone and all we're left with is hybridity. And we just live on from there, and it kind of gets mushy, if you ask me. And the other school of thought was this idea of recovery, that there are things that are left, that we can potentially recover them or track back using genealogy to identify what still exists that we can learn from, that can subvert the violence of the modern world in which we live. And maybe we can find models for a more moral, righteous, peaceful, dignified future. For me, the recovery, I was also introduced to Islam at the same time. And it became very, very apparent to me that Islam was the only viable, intact force against the hegemony of capitalism, of colonialism, of the Western zeitgeist in general. That one by one, other civilizational forces had folded. Even Chinese culture, Taoism, Buddhism, Hinduism, and allowed themselves to be perverted into a neo-tradition. Not an actual tradition, not a continuity, but a neo-tradition. That was really something modern in the garb of something older. Mm-hmm. And of course, Christianity was lost a long, long time ago, as was Judaism. And so Islam, as this very potent, gravitas, stable force, with all of its messiness, was something that was very attractive to me, and that was the long path of me accepting Islam and then going abroad to study it. It wasn't until I graduated with my degree in Shariah, and I didn't think I was going to get involved in political theory again, that I came back and discovered Hallaq. And he had written, of course, many, many books at this point. He's, advanced in his career. And Hallaq summarized for me and distilled and concentrated many of the insights that I had stumbled upon and then furthered them even more. He spoke about, as his object of inquiry and the technology, you could say, or the arrangement, the configuration, that illustrates a certain epistemology, a certain way of viewing the world. He made the nation state the object of his inquiry with a pretty simple question. Is the nation state a trans-historical, or the state, let's say, a trans-historical universal entity? Can we say that the Prophet ﷺ established an Islamic state in Medina? Can we say that the Ottomans were involved in statecraft from the 1400s onwards? Or is the state in its current form something very, very particular, which was preceded by other arrangements, other configurations that represented other epistemes and other worldviews and other ways of doing things? Of course, Hallaq says the latter, that the nation state is a very particular social arrangement representing a certain epistemology, doing certain work. And in this, he furthers the insight of Asad, which Talal Asad had pointed out that the process of secularism was necessary for the nation state to exist in the first place. That much of the violence that occurred, that now in our secular world we remember as religious wars in Europe in the Middle Ages, were in fact wars of nationalism, wars of state building. And Hallaq's interest was always my interest in undergrad, but of course he articulated it in a way that I could not. What is the structure and logic of this violence? Is this violence ubiquitous? Do we just throw up our hands, as the apologists for Western crimes do, and say, everybody's colonized? The Muslims used to colonize, the Chinese colonized, the Indians colonized. Is it a ubiquitous universal force? Or is it something particular? Is it something unique? Is it something even unprecedented in human history? Of course, Hallaq says it's unprecedented, it's unique. There's never been anything like the violence of the modern nation state. Why? How? What's the difference? There's many. Some of them were foreshadowed by Foucault when Foucault talked about the difference between sovereign and disciplinary power. Sovereign power being the old monarch summons the criminal to the court, cuts his head off in public. That's the sovereign power. Very visceral, very bodily, very public and on display. Disciplinary power is the power of the Ministry of Education. It's the power of the jail and the rehabilitation program, or the re-education camps in East Turkmenistan. That is disciplinary power. The power to keep your body as it is and to hollow out what is inside of it, of worldview, of ideology, of epistemology, and to replace it with something else. How do we control your thoughts and your subjectivity? How do we socially engineer particular subjects such that they'll never rebel in the first place? That is the violence that Foucault called disciplinary violence. And so it was Hallaq furthering this insight from Foucault that the modern nation state is different. But the intervention and what makes Hallaq different is that he goes even more fundamental and foundational than that. Why the difference between these two types of violence? Where does it come from? Is it inevitable? Is it avoidable? The answer is in the subtitle to Hallaq's work on restating Orientalism, which is
a critique
of modern knowledge. In fact, he told me personally, he said, restating Orientalism was clickbait. He said that was for the publisher. The real title is the subtitle, A Critique of Modern Knowledge. For Hallaq, it all rests in the ways of knowing. How does one know? What are the ethics of knowing and the ethics of knowledge in the first place? And Hallaq's main thesis is that prior to the nation state, prior to modernity, knowledge was an ethical endeavor. It had an undeniable, inseparable, moral dimension to it. And his evidence, Exhibit A, is that no other society or civilization or empire has produced an equivalent to Orientalism. The Chinese did not study the Indians or the people of the Malay archipelago in the way that Europe studied them. The Muslims or the Arabs did not study the French, the Franks, the sub-Saharan Africans in ways that the Orientalists of Europe did, building out entire departments, deploying these scholars, going forth to the point where, if you're looking to distill it into a singularity, the most representative thing of modern knowledge is the person who has a PhD in Islamic studies and is a kafir. Modern knowledge is held at the arm's distance in the tip of a pen. It is not something that penetrates the heart and asks you to be a better person. There's not a transformative dimension to the things that you know. In other words, it's just a job. You can go from 9 to 5 and be an expert in Islamic history and Shariah and Aqidah and everything else in Quran, and you can recite Quran better than the Arabs. But when the 5 o'clock hits and you punch the card and you check out from your job and go home, you go home to your girlfriend and your dog and your glass of wine and who knows, maybe your family shrine. That is the nature of modern knowledge. On the other hand, the opposition to it, which is not merely Islamic, I don't think that Hallaq is influenced by perennialism, but he couches some of his critiques in perennialist language just to say that this is not something that is particular to Islam. It's indicative of the pre-modern world, and it is still intact in Islam, where it has been ruptured in other civilizations and worldviews. That the very du'at that we began with is completely against this modern formulation. Allahumma alimna ma yanfa'una. Oh Allah, teach us what will benefit us. Meaning we have no interest in knowledge that does not benefit us. Wanfa'na bima alamtana. And benefit us by which you taught us. That we can learn something, it can end us up in the hellfire. Just like the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, in which the reciter of the Quran, the person who gives charity, the mujahid on the battlefield, will be in the hellfire first if they did not have the proper intention. وَزِدْنَا عِلْمًا. And we only ask for quantity after we've taken care of intention and quality. There's a very anti-modern dua to make, according to Hallaq's insight. So we see that the modern nation state is imbued with these values, the fundamental difference, what he calls the distinction. That means that the separation between what he calls the is and the ought. Over here on the side of is knowledge, which is completely secularized, desanctified, objectified knowledge that anybody can study with no expectation that it transform them or make them into a better person. And on the other side is the ought. And the ought is privatized and limited to the family and to your church or to your mosque or whatever you do in your free time. We don't really care. And that this bifurcation between is and ought, which he calls the distinction, is the fundamental thing upon which the nation state is made. Because the nation state is built upon this distinction, it does not exist for any purpose, whereas the Sharia exists for a purpose. The purpose being to glorify Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and do His work on earth. The state does not exist for any purpose above itself, whereas the even a pre-modern sultanate, let's say, existed underneath the confines of the Sharia. It could not generate another Sharia or law outside of what was handed down by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So the state is a political arrangement and technology that is completely divorced from a larger purpose or any type of overarching authority. It now exists solely for itself. What happens when it exists solely for itself and its own perpetuation is that everything that the state touches is instrumental. The state, don't mistake the proper understanding of secularism, according to Assad. The state will use religion all the time. In fact, usually, it must use religion in order to justify what it does. But it instrumentalizes religion. It is not accountable to religion. It instrumentalizes it. Whereas another alternative arrangement would have the governance, whatever we want to call it, accountable to religious norms. There are certain things that are out of bounds that no one can step outside of. Another aspect of the difference between one of, I think, the ways to describe the nation state is untethered. And Hallaq makes this point in a variety of ways as well. The first way in which it is untethered, it's untethered from purpose and morality, which we've just discussed. It's also untethered from collective community life, which highlights another dimension of the Ummah, or whatever we want to call it, whatever is the Islamic alternative. You could call it Khilafah, you could call it whatever you want. By design, the Islamic Ummah, the people, are a force of gravity and, to some extent, authority and law. When the Prophet ﷺ said that my Ummah will not agree on an error, and there is a concept of ijma', and there's a concept of bay'ah, which is the ratification of an individual political leader, there's a recognition that the Ummah in collective holds something of authority. Something of authority that in modern democracies they pretend exists, which is popular will, sovereign will of the people. But in the nation state, we see these things, especially in America, they're very, very stark. That who is, when push comes to shove, actually the nation? It's always the state. That when the US government says, whenever Imam Tom returns from Malaysia, we have to interrogate him for hours at the border, we have to look through his phone, we have to look through his books, we can't understand the languages they're written in, but we're going to look through them anyway. The justification is national security interest. Who's the nation in this confrontation? Am I the nation? Or is the state the nation? The state, even if it deploys a discourse of national community from which it supposedly draws its authority, due to the arrangement of power in the nation state, at the end of the day, the state is always the nation. Whereas in the Ummah remains the Ummah, and nobody has been able to come up with a way of claiming to be representing the Ummah and yet displacing the Ummah in the same moment. So Islam is bounded by an ethic of collectivity and community that the nation state is not bound to, at least as thickly. The nation state must deploy the language of collectivity to justify itself. It must create a national culture, whether it's, I shouldn't talk about Malay politics, right? Whether it's Bumiputra, or whether it's Americanness. Mm-hmm. It needs to have that construct, right? It needs to construct a national identity, okay? But at the end of the day, it's the state and its power that gets to decide when that applies, when it doesn't. Hallaq talks about Schmitt's, the state of exception, right? When push comes to shove, the nation state can suspend all the rules, can throw out everything, and say, due to the national interest, we have to take your life. Whereas the type of collectivity and community ethic that the Ummah is based in is just more real. There are more connective threads. It's more difficult for a sultan or whatever you want to call it to be able to completely pull away and be untethered from the Ummah that has given him his bay'ah and his ratification. I want to get to questions and conversations, so I'll just roll through a couple more points. Some people say, and I'll anticipate a few critiques here because Hallaq is much misunderstood and much critiqued. Some people, I'll put a typology of critiques of Hallaq's works in two broad categories. One, there's a group of people who critique Hallaq's work for being pessimistic, for supposedly being anti-Islamist. So the Islamists in the beginning did not like Hallaq. They said, impossible state, what are you talking about? We can build a state. We had Morsi's Egypt. We have whatever, this movement, that movement, that movement. But when Hallaq was talking about the impossibility of the state, he wasn't talking about the impossibility of Islamic governance. He was trying to get people to think beyond the nation state as a model of governance, to imagine a future in which other arrangements of governance could exist that would be more accountable to the Ummah in ways that Muslim governance used to be more accountable to the Ummah, as opposed to the untethered, self-justifying nation state. The other camp saw Hallaq's work as idealist and utopian, that they accused him of slaughtering history, this like completely ahistorical, minimizing, downplaying the degree to which sultans would abuse their authority and act out of bounds of the Shariah, and all of these things. Hallaq's forthcoming book, is a response to those critics. So he's done a lot of extensive research to articulate and to demonstrate exactly what the relationship and degree of control was by the executives of various Islamic civilizations and empires and their people, in order to demonstrate that the type of authority and the reach of authority that a pre-modern Muslim executive enjoyed is nothing close to the type of penetration and reach and control that the modern nation state has, with its Ministry of Education, with its Ministry of Health, with its Ministry of everything controlling your life, what you learn, etc. So can there be a model that is not the nation state? Will we get to a time where the nation state does not exist? And this is something that other people critique Hallaq for. They're saying that this is all just utopian nonsense. The nation state is here to stay. Certainly, if you look at the map, the nation state is ubiquitous. We have a mental imaginary dominated by the nation state. Yet, the nation state is quite young as a political technology. Much younger, say, than empires or city-states or things of that nature. Simply through empirical history alone, we can hope to expect that the wheel of history will turn again and nation state will become a thing of the past, and something else that we can't even imagine yet might replace it. And so Hallaq's works generate a curiosity, and I think also contain an imperative to imagine that day and to try to think about what opportunities will be present on that day and to participate in shaping that day as opposed to being caught unawares. You could liken it to some of the ethno-nationalist movements that arose in the early 1900s, such as Zionism, who had prepared for a day where they would see a Jewish supremacist ethno-state in Palestine. And they did the work and made the moves to be ready for that day when the British mandate ended, as opposed to other nations, whether they're Kurds, whether they're Assyrians, whether they're Circassians, where they were not able to exploit that rupture in history when the time came, for whatever reason. Not necessarily saying it was their fault or anything, but the idea is that ruptures in history come. The structure of history is that these ruptures do come along. And you can either plan for them and get ready for them and attempt to exploit them, or at least influence and steer them, inflect them, or you can not. But if you don't, then you might not like the results that come forth. From the past, of course, we know for a fact that Islamic governance in a non-nation state model exists, and it existed, and it is possible. The real question is how to chart a course to what comes next. How do things look in an age where things such as digital currencies like Bitcoin, or technology, communities that arise over technological platforms such as social media, might present challenges to a territorial-based model such as the nation state? What types of ruptures are starting to already form? And how might they indicate or foreshadow what successive future political arrangements might look like? And how could we as Muslims leverage those things in a way that is better fitting to the Ummah? And that's really Hallaq's point, is that when he calls it an impossible state, he's not saying that the Muslims are doomed to be out of power forever. He's really just saying that the nation state is the worst possible fit for the Muslim Ummah, because the Muslim Ummah is inherently rich and diverse and messy and complicated and large. And it's inherently localized in various ways. It rejects homogeneity, which the nation state demands homogeneity, which is also why capitalism is a problem. And I know that we probably want to talk about capitalism at some point later, but I might keep that to open discussion. Whereas the Ummah and even the Shariah is inherently heterogeneous. So how do we hope for and plan for and move towards a political arrangement that will be able to leverage that inherent heterogeneity that we have in our Ummah in a way that contributes to our power, as opposed to one that inhibits it, one that demands homogenization, which often results in genocide. Actually, you could say that the symptom of the nation state, or the era or epoch of the nation states, is genocide. Genocide is the structural symptom of the disease of ethno-nationalism. And you can even trace this to Ottoman history, where you saw the millet system, which was functional, even if imperfect, for centuries. And the massacres that took place towards the end of the Ottoman era, after the Tanzimat reforms, after the Ottomans had undergone this process of becoming a nation state, of nationalizing. All of a sudden the Kurds are a problem. All of a sudden the Armenians are a problem. The Circassians are a problem. They're a problem because they were trying to form a Turkish nation. And the logic of modernity and the logic of national homogeneity puts those people on the outside looking in. Maybe we'll stop it here and we'll open up. I know there's a lot more to say. I have a lot. This has been a very, very fruitful trip. Some of the discussions we've had over dinner have been discussions I've been having with various people since I've been here. Issues of culture, Shariah and culture, the indigenization of Islam in various communities. How do cultural forms assist the Sharia-based society and the Muslim Ummah? When does the government only hinder its work by engaging in censorship? Many, many things that are relevant to Malaysian society and other societies as well across the Ummah. But I think that we'll just end the one-way conversation here and open it up to everybody else. Barakallahu feekum.
So, inshallah, I will open the floor, inshallah.
Bismillah. My name is Muhammad Falah. I want to explore a tangent that I'm not sure whether Hallaq explored or not. On central banking, it has a political element, not necessarily on the usual political side that you always imagine, but it certainly has a political element to it. And when you mention about control, about locality, about heterogeneity, I would assume that Hallaq will also be opposed against this. But I would like to ask your view on what would Hallaq say on this. What central banking or monetary governance or system will look like in an ideal Sharia state?
It's a great question. I think that it's important to recognize how the central bank functions and the Ministry of Finance functions for the nation state politically. And that kind of leads us to the answer. That when the Ottomans were undergoing the Tanzimat reforms, for example, they eventually banned the Waqf and they appropriated the funds, and the funds were put towards warfare and modernization efforts. And I can't think of a more symbolic demonstration of betrayal of what the Sharia stands for and what Islamic governance stands for than that. And I bring it up in terms of banking because the way that currency works and central banking works, and this is not my area of expertise, so please start taking your grains of salt, but politically is that they create an advantageous situation for the state when it comes to inflation, their spending power vis-a-vis the spending power of the average person. And there's all types of other tools of manipulation, but the end result is the same, that the state benefits most by these things. Having the currency and the monetary system under strict control organizes a particular type of modern violence that the nation state engages in. Whereas the black market, right? The economy that is outside of the state's control, the irregulated market, the barter system, these are things that escape the control of the state. They are therefore not taxable. The tax cannot build the war chest or the war machine. Again, I'm coming from an American context here, but we see it very starkly. And the tools of currency manipulation can't be used. They cease to become relevant if people use methods that are outside of the of the central banking system or the monetary system. That's at least as far as I see it. There's probably other things for people who are more qualified in economics and banking, but I am observant of the political dimension to these things. So I strongly suspect that Hallaq would advocate for types of currency and banking instruments that are autonomous and independent of state control, because the state existing for itself, even in spite of the nation it purportedly represents, they become tools of that disciplinary power of the state. That's at least how I see it.
So inshallah. There's one thing I remember when he said Hallaq told about the state is genocidal. He explicitly said that the current nation state is inherently genocidal, structurally genocidal. So it's one of the things that why genocide happened nowadays is inherently because of modernity and the nation state itself, the phenomena of nation state. So, do you have any question today? Not just question, if you have any discussion? Okay.
Assalamualaikum.
Thanks,
Thank you, Brother Tom, for the brief explanation of Hallaq's work. So the first thing is, I'm impressed how Hallaq idea can come up to this somehow beyond our Muslims' knowledge for the importance of the Ummah itself, beyond the boundary of state. So the first question is, where did Hallaq get this idea? And the second one is, how does he perceive Islam as what? Because he's a Christian, right? Till now, right? So I think the misunderstanding of the importance of Muslim Ummah is we have to emphasize it, and we have to make people of Muslim Ummah feel that from now on we are not lack of the system or of the
Capability.
order of the nation state, what else. We lack of the misunderstanding of the importance of the Ummah itself, because the Ummah is everything. From the Ummah we get the authority, from the Ummah we get the order, and from the Ummah we have the system itself is within the Ummah itself. So maybe it is just, I would just want to ask.
No comment to the second part. To the first part, I think there's at least two, maybe three directions that shape Hallaq's attention that he gives to the Ummah. First, if you're familiar with his body of work, he builds it up through usul al-fiqh. So he has several books on usul al-fiqh. And so he's very attentive to the different, and he goes through this in The Impossible State, the different types of representatives of the Shariah and how they interface with the Ummah. Meaning, and we didn't talk about this actually in the intro, I probably should have, but one of the most significant differences between the modern nation state and Islamic governance is the location of sovereignty, right? That in the nation state model, sovereignty is wink wink, nudge nudge in the people, the nation, but in reality it is exclusively usurped by the state. There is no, and he points to law and he says there is no law but the state's law. Okay, that's a symbol and a symptom of the fact that the only sovereign power that is tolerated is the state. Another illustration is the fact that in the United States, we have indigenous groups. There was an indigenous group that attempted to make their own passport and travel with it because the language of their status within the government is as an independent autonomous nation. So they called the bluff of the language and they said, if we're really an autonomous nation, then we should be able to make a passport and travel. Of course, they were denied. No one would recognize it. But it forced the facade became visible. So that's the nation state with all of the sovereign power allocated to the state itself. Whereas in the Sharia, you have a tiered system of sovereignty and the delegation of sovereignty. So all sovereignty ultimately belongs to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He expresses that sovereignty through the Sharia. The interpreters of the Sharia are the guardians of that sovereignty. And then there are a couple things such as the ijma' and the bay'ah where they are delegated to the ummah, right? Not in whole, but in part. And so through this tiered system of sovereignty, we see that it's very, very, very different from that model. So when he goes through usul al-fiqh and he delineates the different types of people who are representatives of that sovereignty, or interpret the expressions of that sovereignty in the Sharia, it necessitates attention towards what's their interface with the actual Ummah. He talks about the Mufti and the Mustafti, right? And he makes a large point that's very important about the localized nature of that relationship, or how it should be localized. And one of the great tragedies of our time is the online fatwa bank, because the nature of fatwa is supposed to be localized and intimate, one-to-one. And it also, it demonstrates that this is exactly where this sovereignty operates. It operates at the local level, and it's operating from the Mufti to the Mustafti. So that's one, I think, area in which it shows his attention to the Ummah, because it's both part of the tiering of sovereignty, and it's also the interface by which the representatives of the Sharia, the interpreters of the Sharia, are relevant. They're relevant because they interpret it for the people. And then the other thing, I think, is that he gets there also just by contrast from the nation state, and seeing how flimsy and fake the lip service given to the nation is, compared to the very real relationships that are there in a more indigenous Islamic governance system. And third, and I think his forthcoming book will also explain this in more detail, the so-called separation of powers, which he endeavors to show doesn't really exist in Western democracies, and maybe perhaps structurally can't exist. That the executive and the legislative and the judicial in a nation-state model always end up cannibalizing one another and spilling out into one another. And so the separation, it does sound good. Actually, it is important, the separation. His argument is just that the nation-state can't do it right. And his argument essentially is that Islamic governance is the only one that will do it right. Because the separation that exists is, and again, this is his forthcoming book, what did I say there when it came to Allah, His Sharia, the interpreters of the Sharia, and then the Ummah? Where's the Sultan? He's very negligent in comparison to the one who gets to speak for the nation state, right? So this was trying to answer your question and also some adjacent questions, but hopefully that makes sense.
Sure.